Well, that was unexpected. Things got out of hand. I spent a week away from home gathering footage and interviews and demos for this awesome VR thing going on, and then this happens and it just recontextualizes the whole week. Making matters worse is that I'm also going through a bit of a cold, so my vocals here are gonna sound like Kiefer Sutherland on a good day. But no, okay, I get it. Facebook acquiring Oculus is scary because they're an evil company with no experience in hardware who violates your privacy to sell targeted ads to uninformed markets who don't know how to get around them, who are also the demographic for exploitive microtransaction games. But it's important to remember that the Oculus Rift is a fairly open hardware platform. It's not a piece of software. It's a display. It's practically a monitor that you strap to your face that has motion sensors attached, and how the hell do you integrate intrusive social networking features onto a monitor? They've announced no plans to change the Rift itself. They've said that they're not going to try to profit off the hardware.
I mean, we're clearly not a hardware company. We're not going to try to make a profit off of the devices long term.
And I guarantee you that there's no way that game software on the Rift was not already going to coexist with non-gaming social software on the Rift, had they stayed independent. Sony was already tossing up ideas for those implications last week. The last two big acquisitions that Facebook has made are pretty much still doing fine. The Rift is already very far along in development, they've got an absolute dream team on staff, and nothing right now suggests that the final product will be beaming ads directly into your eyes while you play the entire Illusion software library. Maybe this is a situation where it would be better to just wait and see how the final product turns out before canceling your games or canceling your pre-orders. Being owned by a big company doesn't always mean big changes. Hell, both Giant Bomb and GameSpot are owned by CBS, and people play it up like they're still rivals with one another. And, I mean, I'm not trying to sound like an apologist here. Corporate consolidation sucks, but it's not the end of the world. And if worse comes to worse, there are alternatives to the Rift. Because of Oculus, VR is already becoming a very lively and competitive marketplace, and VR is about a lot more than that headset. It's about adapting game designs to fit new methods of how we understand both inputs and displays. Games made specifically for VR will radically change game design. It reminds me a lot of the generational switch from 2D to 3D, where new technological innovations created new technological limitations that developers had to get creative and work around. If the current game industry is creatively stuck in an endless rut of military first-person shooters and sandboxy third-person shooters, then VR could be just what we need to disrupt that. Those genres aren't as reliable in VR, and the developers that do manage to come up with high-quality, well-funded games specifically built for VR are going to be working on the frontier of entirely new genres. They are going to decide what the new normal is, and whatever it is, it will not look like what's normal right now. That being said, here's how I was gonna start us off before this whole Facebook mess began. It is around 8:45 a.m. I am walking down 3rd Street in San Francisco on Wednesday, getting ready to start my GDC videos for this year. And I hope you weren't expecting these things to have production values. Because this year I have a little bit more production values than I did last year. I got a legit press pass. That's cool. Apparently Bunny Hop is legit enough to get a legit press pass. I have some neat audio equipment. I brought along some lapel mics, some portable recorders, and a cardioid microphone, which is going to be interesting. But more helpful than both of those is Will.
Hi.
Thank you, Will. GDC is a place where the creative innovators and the cutting-edge indulgers have to coexist with one another. The theme of this year's expo seemed to be VR. Even before the show floors opened on Wednesday, one of the first things I heard was that Sony was rumored to announce a VR headset for the PS4 that was going to compete with the Oculus Rift. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. I guess the one thing that actually surprised people was that Project Morpheus was ready to be shown the day after its announcement, and that pretty much solidified the VR theme for the rest of the week. When I wasn't hanging out with Campster, I was checking out VR. When I wasn't interviewing fabulously mustached men, I was checking out VR. When I wasn't interviewing accomplished game developers, I was... well, you get the idea. I kind of liked how the Sony press conference didn't make an overt attempt of selling their VR headset as a gimmicky peripheral. They were calling it a new medium. They gave some very straight and serious development advice, and they stressed the fact that there isn't really a dirty and quick method for interpreting how games should work here. It's the Wild West, and it's also a reason for them to push motion controls again. Project Morpheus will be using the PlayStation camera to track head movements, and they're also going to be using the Move controllers, which is kind of hilarious. People didn't like motion controls last gen, but the difference here is that from your own first-person perspective, motion controls make a whole lot more sense. Well, actually, the PS Move controller for the Morpheus demo I did play didn't seem to track movement on the Z-axis, which means you couldn't shove the gun up into your face and use iron sights, but that means that conventional first-person shooter rules don't work here, so yay, disruption! It's an interesting contradiction. While everyone loves to talk shit about motion controls, everyone loves to get hyped for VR, and the head tracking of a VR headset is motion control. And the motion controls of Project Morpheus can affect your sense of depth, scale, and self-awareness in that virtual world.
Alright, so I just walked out of the Sony Morpheus demo, and it was the Shark Tank demo. What happens is you go underwater in a shark tank, and a shark jostles the tank and tears it up, and there's blood and profanity, and it's a horrible, violent episode for a deep-sea scuba dive. But anyways, the thing that impresses me about this technology and what the demo was specifically there to show off was a sense of scale, how VR kind of makes the player aware of the proportions of their own character in a way that you might not be used to, because up close that shark looks freaking huge, and you don't really notice it until you start moving your head physically and see just how much of the shark those little movements cover.
During the conference, they were talking about how player scale is important, how doorways have to be placed and sized correctly, or else players would feel weird. You ever notice how your eyes cover less of the surface of an object when you move your head around it from further away? If you have two eyes, you have depth perception, and when that shark in the demo gets close to you, you end up seeing a lot more of it out of your two eyes when you move your head. It makes you feel smaller the closer it gets. It would be wild to play a game where you're a giant, or a game where you're tiny, or maybe even a game where you're never sure of how big or small you're supposed to be. And maybe someone will make a game where those dimensions of physical space don't work like how they do in reality. Using VR, a developer could actively deform the models and geometry inside of a game based on the inputs of the player's head movements. That sense of depth and scale and the ability to play with it is a new way to play. It's almost a new dimensional axis of directional input for developers and players to wrap their heads around, and that is nuts! The visual quality of the Morpheus prototype was somewhere between last year's Oculus Rift prototype and this year's Crystal Cove prototype. There's some slight motion blur on the Morpheus when you turn your head, and that becomes easy to ignore, but this prototype did give the impression that VR on consoles will be visibly blurrier than what Oculus has planned for PC. And that's despite me remembering that last year's Oculus Rift was way too blurry for me.
You can talk about unrealistic expectations, but that shit was blurry as hell.
I was a cynical bastard about this stuff last year, but I don't know. This year, maybe I turned into a big, giant marketing sponge, but for some reason I was seeing a lot more of the merits of VR this time.
So I just played the new Oculus Rift demo, and I gotta say I'm a lot more impressed than I was with last year's version of it. The dev kit that they're using nowadays has a much higher resolution, so a lot of the problems I was having with the blurriness in the Hawken demo from last year are alleviated. But the thing is, it also might just be due to clever trickering. There is no HUD in this new demo with a lot of small details that you need to point out to be able to play the game effectively. And the game itself is kind of a meta game. You play as a guy sitting in a comfortable chair in a living room, playing a game on a table with another player, and the seating arrangement in this room resembles the seating arrangement that they have set up in the demo booth out there. Presence is going to be a deal breaker with VR, and what they've done with this new demo is made the presence inside of the game resemble the presence outside of the game, and that does a lot to trick your brain into believing, or at least kind of accepting the usability of the illusion that your eyes are seeing in front of your face.
It's odd that Oculus, arguably the most recognizable name in VR, was showcasing the least creative demo. You were very much playing a traditional video game in the Oculus demo, without any wacky motion controls. You were sitting down, playing as someone sitting down, playing a game, and your brain instantly recognizes what's going on. But since the fidelity of the assets isn't photorealistic enough to not look like a video game, the higher levels of your psyche are constantly weirded out by the juxtaposition between the stylized graphics and the accurate sense of depth and head movements, and I was just enjoying the novelty of it. But establishing a convincing sense of presence is going to be one of the biggest challenges of VR, and not one of its strengths. After all, you're not anything like those over-the-top video game heroes you love. You're not a brawny, manly spy or a crazy cyborg ninja. You're just some guy sitting on your ass. So unless you're playing as some other guy sitting on their ass, you're going to lose out on a lot of the more interesting immersive qualities of VR. And a lot of the more interesting VR input methods that were shown off actually want you to get up off your ass and play games in more active ways. After all, we may even be moving away from controllers and keyboards here. Prio VR is a company that's interpreting motion controls in a fairly literal way, by straight up strapping a motion capture suit onto the player. They've kickstarted the project with 3 tiers of products that'll cover an increasing range of limb movements, ranging in price from $280 to $400. They're not just selling it as a game device though, but also as an actual motion capture suit for developers to cheaply make motion captured animation with.
What are you developing Prio VR for? Is this for consoles or PC?
Essentially, what we're developing for initially is we're targeting the PC market, but we are in talks with console manufacturers about extending into those markets once the initial Kickstarter and the initial units ship. So we're looking to actually hit all of those market spaces. And essentially what Prio VR does is it is a full-body motion tracking suit that's at a consumer-friendly price point that essentially allows you to put your entire body into a immersive simulation, whether that be on just a TV like we see behind us here, or in conjunction with a virtual reality headset or head-mounted display. And what we've done to support game development is made a rich API layer and drop-in support for major game engines like Unity, like Unreal's UDK, and like CryEngine. So it's essentially what our job is to make it as easy as possible for developers to support this technology and integrate it into their projects.
And what sort of new movements will these hand movements allow or add to conventional game designs that we're already used to?
And that's one of the exciting things for us is that traditional games are either using a hand controller where you have this finite set of buttons, or you have a limited set of things you can do. If you want to do something complicated, you have some combo moves, or you're using a mouse and keyboard where you have key bindings and a mouse. But what the problem with those is it's a very unnatural experience and you have to learn it's different for every game.
And do you think there's going to be a lot of challenges managing to get games to support new VR options, or do you think they're going to kind of coexist with the conventional mouse and keyboard or controller layout in the future?
I think right now it's a lot of at least the AAA titles have a kind of a wait and see approach, but a lot of the big houses, they don't take a lot of risks. They like to protect that revenue stream. So we're going to see a lot of indie developers developing for things like this first, and then in the next probably year or two, we're going to see an explosion of this technology being supported, because it really is kind of a much better experience than you can get with just a hand controller. The things you can do with this that is a natural, especially for virtual reality where you need that immersion.
The demo that they're using is like an unholy mashup between Jurassic Park Trespasser and DayZ, and despite how utilitarian and basic its assets may be, the general glitchiness of the animation does make for a bit of slapstick, but it also makes a huge statement about just how differently even conventional games built for one specific VR rig will control compared to other games for other hardware. Developers are going to have to work with much different designs than what we're used to. For this conventional first-person zombie shooter, you're not just a floating crosshair. Pointing and aiming at things is a much more elaborate process, and the outcomes of your melee combat rely on how the game design interprets things like the acceleration and the direction of your arm swings and how their range and power should be interpreted in the game. It reminded me a lot of Jurassic Park Trespasser because that's kind of how the hands here control. Except here, the motion control scheme actually makes it playable. And believe it or not, there's actually still a very active and passionate Trespasser fan community who appreciate the extra interactivity that fully controllable hands bring to an FPS. And, well, if Prio VR catches on, we may see a whole lot more games like that. Except this time, they'll be more tolerable for the rest of us. But then there's the issue of how you handle player movement. After all, once you are comfortable with the idea of your arms being fully tracked, you still gotta remember that your legs are not being fully tracked. The Virtuix Omni is a $500 omnidirectional treadmill that comes with its own special kind of shoes, and a harness, a belt, a big plastic gun, and a big plastic frictionless crater that you carefully slide around in to input leg movements.
Yeah, so we're here showing off the Omni. The Omni is a virtual reality platform that's going to allow you to walk, run, jump, sidestep, perform all the gaming moves you need, and have it translated into the virtual world. So we're compatible with almost any PC game or application, and it's really a plug-and-play system.
So how does that compatibility work? Do you just map your footsteps to what would be analog stick or keyboard presses with WSAD?
Exactly, you have it exactly right, where we can either generate keystrokes based on your movements, or we can also map it via analog joystick control.
What about measuring the differences of speed if you're walking slow or if you're running really fast? Is it up to the game to interpret that movement, or how does the drivers for the Omni interpret speed into the game?
Sure, so there's two answers to that. First, to be backwards compatible with existing games, we can have a threshold. If you start running at a certain speed on the Omni, it'll basically press shift, and that's how you'll be able to sprint in the game. Now, for future games that are developed with our SDK and API, we can actually give you the raw data so you can do one-for-one movement speed. So as fast as you're walking on the Omni is how fast your character will move in the virtual environment.
So there is some degree of customization required to fully take advantage of the technology. Do you have any particular game support ready right now?
Yeah, so again, any PC game will work out of the box with the Omni, and that's where we're going to be generating keystrokes and then having a threshold in order to press shift. Now, in the future, we are offering our API and SDK, which will be available in the coming weeks, and then we're actually developing some games in-house, and then we're offering that SDK available to developers around the world.
The way that this radically unconventional input device manages to coexist with totally conventional games is by translating your walking and your running into keystrokes. And therein lies the problem. I didn't get to try the Omni, but Will did, and he said that it didn't really work. His biggest issue was that he didn't feel his footsteps register because of his walking, but rather because of his feet hitting the ground, as if it was using pressure pads instead of motion sensors. According to him, you can actually work around the system just by tapping your feet in a certain direction, as if you were pressing a button. And the reason for that may be because of the very fixed, rigid, and digital movement that button presses result in. Until those future games developed with the Omni's API give us one-to-one movement accuracy, the device is basically a really convoluted set of WSAD keys. But your legs are not at all. We've all played QWOP. We know how complicated walking actually is, and every step you take moves the rest of your body with varying degrees of distance and direction that the digital input of a keystroke just does not represent. It seems like the more VR tries to be like real life, the more difficult it becomes to input the most basic and gamey control functions. And that is where developers will have to get creative. But one rig in particular, which no one is talking about for some reason, provided one of the most convincing and elegant demonstrations of VR from the whole show. The Sulon Cortex was the closest thing at GDC to realizing a real-life holodeck. The device is billed as an AR headset instead of VR, since it displays camera output of the room that you're in, but once the operator pressed a button that spawned a portal that took me away from the real life and into something else, my reaction was pretty fantastic.
So if you pan around, do you see a blue column?
Oh, yeah, now I do. It's in front of you.
Yeah, so you can slowly walk towards it.
Okay. Does something happen if I get inside?
You can walk and find out.
I'm afraid of walking into stuff. Whoa! Oh, okay. Now I'm in some kind of really fantastical sci-fi environment. I have literally no bearing on where the real walls are anymore.
Well, this virtual room is mapped to the physical room that you're in right now. So if you actually walk up and touch,
I almost lost my balance.
so your height is actually mapped, so if you actually bend down.
Oh yeah, okay. Wow, I wonder how close I can actually get. Huh. This is crazy. There's some weird monster in a cage there, and I kind of want to walk towards it, but I'm afraid of hitting something.
You can walk up.
Even you walk to a wall,
Okay.
you'll see a BB sign, which means...
Alright, tell me if I'm about to hit something, because I literally cannot
This is
tell right
okay,
now.
tell you. Look around for some friends.
Oh no, they're zombies. Oh no! Okay, wow, they totally put zombies right in front of me, and it kind of feels weird to instinctively just shoot at them from this interface, but that's what I'm doing by instinct, okay.
So the zombie model just kind of did a swipe towards my face, and my instinctive reaction was to go back. And I feel kind of bad because I'm pressing this button that shoots this gun, but I know there are people back there. Okay.
Ah, you got me.
Oh, I did?
No, I'm just kidding.
Oh wait, can you tell? Because like from my perspective, there actually is a projectile coming out in the direction of your voice. All right, another blue cube. Should I walk in?
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, I have to keep in mind that there are walls everywhere.
Alright, I'll take a picture.
Cool. That was cool. No problem.
This headset tracks your position inside of a room via sensors on top of the headset that seem like they're measuring your distance from the walls. That way, without any big, bulky equipment, every step you do take is accurately represented in the game. And it's tracking the ceiling as well, so you can even duck down and plant your face on the floor if you want to, and those movements will still be accurately captured in the game. This one barely even qualifies as a control scheme. Your motions don't feel like a substitute for a controller. Your whole body is captured in a much more simple, elegant, and ultimately convincing way.
The Sulon Cortex is surprisingly enough the closest thing that I think is being shown that actually realizes a classic depiction of futuristic VR. It's tethered to a mobile device, which is weird. They're using their own proprietary headset that it isn't an Oculus or anything to do with the Sony product, which is also weird. But unlike the other products, it tracks the whole room that you're in. It turns that room into something else, and it allows you to completely walk around it at the same speed you're walking around in real life, at the same height you're walking around in real life. It tracks both of your hands with a Razer Hydra setup that I imagine is pretty similar to the Razer Hydra first-person shooter demo on the Oculus that you've seen flying around YouTube. It seems like the problems with this one are more related to the actual space that the player is inside. You might end up smacking stuff. You might end up walking into stuff that's there in real life but not there in VR, and if those are actual legit problems that this product faces, then I feel like it might actually be doing something right.
I guess, at the time, I probably shouldn't have suggested that having those problems is a good thing. After all, it would be nice to just not have any problems at all, but I could see the Sulon Cortex having some serious trouble with appealing to the gaming crowd and its developers. It's not built for high-end gaming devices, it's built for mobile phones actually, and it is intended to be an AR device instead of a VR device. There's no telling if it's going to be able to transform the rooms of your own house into some totally different fantasy landscape like it did to the little portable room for the GDC demo, but what that demo represented was what had me so excited. In a way, it was the ultimate science fiction vision of how VR should work. It was a convincing full-body interface with some kind of crazy virtual world that required nothing but a headset and a little controller. You put the gear on, and suddenly you are somewhere else.
The Sulon Cortex is a visor that transforms your mobile device into a dynamic holodeck experience in your own living environment, transforming your living space or your backyard or a park into a holodeck studio.
I also remember you saying earlier that you were choosing to support mobile phones so that you could accommodate for improvements in the cameras.
It's not just cameras, it's just that the mobile race and the way that mobile technology evolves over months, we're trying to piggyback off that race because we feel that when it comes to resolution and update rates and really getting that camera, the high-end camera incorporated into consumer electronics, the mobile technology or tablet technologies in general are racing at a really fast rate. Right now, even 2K devices are already in play, so what you experience with the 1080p what you experience with a 1080p mobile experience, with a 2K experience, you're going to get double the pixel density and even more sharper images.
There's a moment in there when you walk through a blue column of light when your whole environment changes. Previously, it's using an image from the camera, but then the walls change. And I was wondering, how do you think game designers can accommodate for a virtual space that might be scaled differently than the player's real space?
We've taken that for we've taken care of that for you with our virtual reality engine. The engine applies geometric transformations to your existing Unity environment and applies it to your physical environment.
The little room that they demoed this device in was built to the exact dimensions of the 3D room they overlaid on top of it. How well will this device recognize different rooms of different sizes, different layouts, lighting, or color schemes, and how well will developers be able to build game content that can adapt to those different conditions? Just think of game AI, for example. How do you build a basic zombie survival scenario that plays out in your own house? Unlike building pretty much any other kind of zombie game, it would have to be totally unscripted and work with very versatile content. You'd have to think about what parts of a person's house the zombies could climb into and out of, how they'd handle closed doors or solid walls, or on an even more basic level, just how their AI would interpret panoramic photographs from a camera as a 3D world. VR, AR, and all these crazy new input devices in between present huge developmental challenges, and some new problems that are still hard for me to even wrap my mind around. And that's what has me excited. Those problems mean progress. Technological progression precedes creative expression. The popular example is Jimi Hendrix and the electric guitar. Same goes with all the electric musicians that came afterwards. The Shining wouldn't have worked without the invention of the Steadicam. The scrolling backgrounds that make Super Mario Bros. Work were not possible on previous consoles. Creative people that make masterpieces can't do it without some kind of technological medium to work with. And what kind of masterpieces will developers make with this new technology? There are a lot of problems with it, problems relating to the natural bodily limitations of motion controls, or of the player's physical space around them, and the sheer capabilities of the hardware, but that's okay. These new rules are going to break our old rules. Developers have proven time and time again that working within limitations leads to creative energy and creative solutions. The people that make games for VR from the ground up without ever intending for them to be played outside of VR are going to have to work within those limitations. They're going to have to resort to tricks and hacks and compromises to get it right. Games have been stuck in a creative rut for far too long now, but new games that are built for VR are going to have to get creative and experiment with new things. Being immersed in a 3D world has always been a powerful experience, and now we have an incredible amount of ways to make that experience even more powerful. And someone is eventually going to make a masterpiece out of it, and I can't wait for that to happen. Kept you waiting, huh?